Okay, Dave, if you were to add up the number of degrees between the two of us.
That'd be, what, 3?
3. Right. Okay. Our guest today has 4.
Okay.
If you were to add up the number of books between the two of us that we've written.
Oh, boy.
So I've written 9.
What have I written? Like 4 or something.
Yeah, so that's like less than half.
Okay.
Our guest has written 30.
Wow.
Right. So I think we need to get to him. His name is H.W. Brands, and he's up right after this.
The following is a Tony Lasano podcast, an Opie show on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. This is the Minutia Men Celebrity Interview with Rick and Dave.
So I just need to tell our guest that this is the first interview I've seen Dave with a thesaurus sitting right next to him, just in case.
All right, I've got Grammarly set up. I've got AI. I've got I've got my English teacher, Mrs. Schneffelfussel from 1977 here. So we're all
ready for you. So very excited for this guest. You're a New York Times bestselling author, 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist. I mentioned written over 30 books on U.S. history covering pivotal figures and moments, a distinguished professor, perhaps the smartest person we've ever met. Welcome, H.W. Brands, and we're going to call you Bill. Is that okay?
Good. Thank you.
We can call you Dr.
Glad to be
Bill.
with you.
All right,
there you go.
We'll get to the important stuff, like if the state of our democracy is going to survive. But before that, I have a more important issue. I've been watching Apple TV's Franklin. Have you seen any of that?
I have not.
Okay. Then you may not be able to answer my question because I'm not buying Michael Douglas as Ben Franklin.
Right.
First of all, he's got a full head of hair.
Yeah, right.
He's... he doesn't talk with any sort of
accent whatsoever.
I mean, he sounds like Michael Douglas in every show
Fatal Attraction
that Michael
whatever.
Douglas has ever been in. So I'm not buying it. Have you heard anything about his portrayal of Ben Franklin?
No, I haven't, but I have some friends and associates who've worked on documentaries and historical films and the like. And one issue comes up again and again, and that is, what should the actors sound like?
Yeah.
And in the first place, it's not really clear what Benjamin Franklin did sound like in real life, because accents have changed over the 250 years since he was around.
Right.
But the other thing is that to his contemporaries, Franklin sounded the way anybody today sounds to our contemporaries.
Right.
So if you give him this exotic accent, then you somehow distance him from his moment. But of course, readers aren't going to buy into some of it, as you suggest, aren't going to buy into this historical figure sounding like somebody they just saw on the street today.
Hey, how you doing? Hey, how you doing? I got this declaration here. How you doing? I'm walking here.
And this is why when they make films that are set in Roman times,
right.
What do they do? Of course, they don't speak Latin, but they give them all British accents.
Right, good point.
So it makes them sound sort of historic. But of course, in Franklin's case, you couldn't give him a British accent because the British are the enemy.
Oh, yeah, right.
So in Hogan's Heroes, the Germans didn't talk that way? Is that what you're telling me?
Wow, all right.
Well, as we mentioned, you've written over 30 books, and one of which, of course, is The Life and Times of Benjamin Franklin. And you definitely have you cover pivotal figures and moments. What sparked your passion for history, and how did it evolve into such a prolific writing career? Because you were a math high school teacher for a while, weren't you? I mean, talk to us about your evolution.
Yeah. So let me start for the math part. I always enjoyed mathematics. I was pretty good at it as a student. And when I sought my first teaching job, I realized it was going to be easier to get a job as a math teacher than as a history teacher, because a lot of high school principals are willing to put, with no disrespect to my colleagues who teach high school history, a lot of them are willing to put somebody in a history classroom who's not necessarily specially trained for history. Yeah. Very often it's a coach of a sports team, and then they double as a history teacher.
Yeah, you just have to stay one week ahead, right?
Yeah, exactly. So mathematics was, I was good at that, I liked it, and I realized I could get a job teaching. But my history interest really originated Well, the deep background might be when my dad would take me and my siblings on Sunday afternoon drives. It was, my dad called it Be Kind to Kitty's Day, but really it was Be Kind to Mama's Day, because she would get an afternoon off. And he would take us around, and we would visit historical sites around Portland, Oregon, where I grew up. So we'd stop at all the historical markers, and we'd visit historic sites. And so somehow it intrigued me that there were people who lived long, long ago. And when you're 7 years old, somebody who lives 50 years ago is long, long ago. But people who lived 200 years ago, wow, that was really cool. So there was that. And then when I was in high school, in ninth grade, I had a history teacher who decided to do an experiment teaching history. And he divided the class into two parts. One part, I call it the control group, did the ordinary, read the textbook, do the work of pages, take the test. And the other, the experimental group, of which I was part, all we did was to read historical novels and historical biographies.
Okay, that sounds like more fun. That's a lot more fun.
Well, it was daunting at first, because he came into the classroom for this experimental group with a stack of books that must have been 25 books high, and said, "This is what you're going to read." And I just loved it, because I would read about these people in the past, and that's what has always intrigued me about the past: the people, not the events so much. I mean, the people take part in events, not the places. Yeah, that's interesting too, but it was the people. What was it like to be alive long ago? And then eventually I got around to reading old diaries and journals of explorers, the journals of Lewis and Clark. And that's a natural for a kid growing up in Oregon. So that's what really sparked my interest. And it maintains the approach to history that I naturally take, is to tell history through the lives and, when I can, through the words of people.
Well, you've obviously done a great job with that. I'm also a history buff. I really enjoy reading about history. I read your Andrew Jackson book, which I thought was amazing. I think the Tribune named it Book of the Year or something like that here in Chicago. Was highly acclaimed. My question about that book is, it is also a book that former President Trump loved, or at least people that worked for him loved. It told him so much about Andrew Jackson that he had a painting of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office. Now, the question I have is, do you see any similarities there between Andrew Jackson and President Trump? Was he making the right connection between the two of them?
So the parallel was drawn when Donald Trump was president. And I think the parallel is accurate up to a point. And the point is sort of stopped short of the individual. So I don't think Donald Trump was much like Andrew Jackson. But I do think that the people who voted for Donald Trump were in many ways similar to the people who voted for Andrew Jackson. Because in both cases, there was an appeal to a populist streak in the American electorate. And in Jackson's case, it was the first populist movement, because before Jackson, American voters voted for their betters, for people who were wealthier than they were, people who were better educated than they were, who had better connections than they were. And that was expected. So, nobody thought you could slap George Washington on the back and say, "Hey, George, how's it going?"
Right.
And, for Jefferson, Madison, the same. The Adamses, they were a little bit more ordinary folks, but they were very well educated and pretty prickly. But Jackson was the first who really didn't have any formal education, who had made his way by hard scrabble and piss and vinegar. So he fought for everything that he got. Now, he turned out to be a consummate gentleman. I mean, very unlike Donald Trump in this regard. He revered women. He would not allow anybody to insult or say anything off color about any woman. And
just like Donald Trump. Just like Donald Trump.
His word was his bond. And he took very seriously any aspersions on his truth-telling. So he made a point of telling the truth. But again, the people who voted for Andrew Jackson, they were essentially putting a finger in the eye of the aristocratic elites who had governed America from George Washington until then. And the people who voted for Donald Trump, they're basically, putting their finger in the eye of the establishment, saying, you have been looking down your noses at us for too long, and we're not going to have it anymore. So there is that connection between what I'll call the Jacksonian movement and the Trumpist movement, not so much between the individuals themselves.
Did Andrew Jackson like ketchup? Do you know by any chance? Was he fond of Kentucky Fried Chicken? I'm just curious.
I don't think ketchup had been invented yet, at least not imported into America.
This is interesting we're talking about because you've expressed that Americans, we place too much importance on the presidency. I think you refer to this as like the cult of the president, right?
Yeah.
And that obviously has affected our modern political landscape, and especially in today's media environment, right? Where everything explodes quickly.
This comes from not having a king, not having royals. So there is something that a lot of people in any country look to their leaders for, in a sense of national unity, somebody that they can identify with, somebody that they can somehow embody the feelings of the country in. And this has fallen kind of by default to the president because we don't have a separate head of state. In our system, the head of state is the head of government. In Britain, King Charles is the head of state, but he doesn't really have anything to do with running the country. So they've got a separate prime minister. And countries with parliamentary systems, that's the way they usually do it. And it works out pretty well that way. But when you have a system like ours where the president is both, then you do certainly have the capability, the possibility of a cult developing around a president. There's no cult of Jimmy Carter, not much of a cult of Richard Nixon, but for certain individuals where there's a kind of charisma, whether it's, it could be the positive charisma of John Kennedy, or you could call it sort of the negative charisma of Donald Trump. Nonetheless, there is this emotional connection that people make to them. It's not true for all presidents. It is true for some presidents. Theodore Roosevelt might be a good example of this. People they really resonated with Theodore Roosevelt. Now, a lot of people despised him, hated his politics, but he did personalize the presidency in a way that previous presidents hadn't. And we still live with a lot of that.
Your opinions of the Founding Fathers, the way you describe them as radicals, which I think is exactly correct, that you believe that they would not want the Constitution to be rigidly interpreted by original intent. Correct? Would that be a fair analysis?
Okay. I think that's true. When they wrote it in 1787, the first place for the United States collectively, this was about the 14th or 15th try at a constitution.
Right.
Because immediately all the states wrote constitutions. Some of them wrote 2 or 3 in the first 10 years. The United States had an original constitution, the Articles of Confederation, but that didn't work, so they had a do-over just 6 years after that one was ratified. So the idea that a constitution would last forever and ever was utterly foreign to them. And Thomas Jefferson actually kind of made this explicit. He said, we believe in self-government. And what we mean is government by ourselves, not by our parents, not by our grandparents, not by our great-great-great-grandparents. And the originalists, they do have a logic behind what they do, but I think it was not the logic of the original drafters of the Constitution. They thought, basically, Jefferson said every generation ought to write its own laws, ought to write its own constitutions. Sometimes he said they ought to have their own revolution too, but eventually he kind of walked that one back. That seemed a little bit radical.
Well, we kind of have that now. We've got a Supreme Court that is writing their own their own lists. For instance, the total immunity for official acts ruling that they just laid down, that kind of comes out of nowhere, right?
Actually, one of the things that has made that Constitution of 1787 survive as long as it has is precisely what you refer to, that each generation does interpret the Constitution according to its own lights. In some respects, this has to be the case. The Constitution says the president is the commander-in-chief of the army in wartime, but what does it say about an air force? There were no air forces, right. But that's a fairly natural extension. But other things, just didn't exist at the time, and you have to figure out what to do. You try to adjudicate in the spirit of the Constitution, but of course, what is spirit of the Constitution to one person is not spirit of the Constitution to another.
Yeah. What do you think they'd be thinking about in your best Ben Franklin voice. Okay, because we don't know what he's talking about. What do you think his view would be?
I don't want to hear any Lutheran. This is going to sound like a Quaker.
Right. I want you to put on, I don't put on your bifocal or not your monocles, spectacles. What do you think any of these guys would be talking, or what their views would be in the contemporary political issues of today? Would they,
This is a question that occurs to me often, and it comes up for my students and people who attend my talks. So, wouldn't it be great if we could have George Washington as president today, or Theodore Roosevelt, or whoever it might be? And my response is, well, I can certainly understand the appeal, because you take a great figure like George Washington, and George Washington come in and set things right today. But the problem with that is historical figures are successful in very large part because they fit their times. If you're too far ahead of your times, nobody listens to you, nobody follows you. You march off, but nobody's behind you. Of course, if you're behind the times, then people don't pay any attention to you for other reasons. You have to suit your times. And George Washington was a good example in that. He made a point of being aloof. He did not get familiar with his subordinates, and he considered basically everybody his subordinates. So he didn't get familiar. He would have been considered today haughty. They would have thought that he sure thinks a lot of himself, that he was too stiff, he was too cold. It wouldn't do well in our politics. In fact, it wouldn't have done well in the politics of America just 2 decades after Washington left the White House. But it worked in his time. And it worked because Americans kind of wanted this unifying figure to pull these 13 states together into this United States. I'll give another example. So Theodore Roosevelt, for his time, was a progressive. In fact, he was for a time a member of the Progressive Party. And progressive then, as now, means that you are looking to government to solve problems. You think that government is too small to deal with the issues the country has to deal with. So Roosevelt wanted bigger government. So that was back in 1910, 1912. Would Roosevelt want bigger government if I could bring him back from the dead and plop him down in 2024? I really have no idea, because government in 1910 was about a 20th the size of government today. Roosevelt might have thought a government twice as big as it was then was the appropriate size. So he would think government today is way too big. So he might be a staunch conservative today, wanting to shrink government down. So that's the problem. We can imagine some of the traits. Roosevelt was, I mentioned, he was a charismatic guy. People responded to him. He was full of energy, full of life. He had lots of great ideas. He said outrageous things time and again. So he was a spectacle, and there's a place for spectacle. But the ones who come along, they fit their moment. I would just add another technical aspect to this. They become masters of the dominant medium of the day. So Roosevelt mastered mass circulation newspapers when they became available in the 1890s, early 1900s. His second cousin, and then eventually uncle by marriage, Franklin Roosevelt, mastered radio. So he was the master of radio. Ronald Reagan, John Kennedy a little bit, really Ronald Reagan was the master of television. And Donald Trump was the master of Twitter. Yeah. So you fit your times in that way as well, because you have to get your point across, and you use the medium that's available at the time.
So, you're talking about the media and the effect that the media can have on politics. And right now we have, Elon Musk at Twitter, who is one of the richest men in the world, who has that power of being a rich man, now has control over a very important information source. But that is really not that different than we've dealt with in the past, right? I mean, in the robber baron era, those guys owned the newspapers. They also had full say in what was going on in those papers. Isn't that something that has kind of been consistent in American history?
It's consistent, but not perfectly so. In America, newspapers originated as organs of political parties.
Right.
So in the first decade of America's existence under the Constitution, there were 3 or 4 major papers, and each one was paid for and supported by, given advertisements by one of the two political parties. And so if you picked up that paper, you knew it was a Federalist paper. If you picked up another paper, you knew it was a Jeffersonian Republican paper. And this was true through the 19th century. Now, in the 19th century particularly, there were lots of newspapers. So New York City, in the middle of the 19th century, had something like 8 or 9 daily newspapers. And so you could have 3 of them were Republican papers, 4 of them were Democratic papers, and some of them were know-nothing papers and various other things. So you could choose your newspaper to suit your political taste. Now, starting in actually the television age, around 1950 or so, the idea that a single news outlet ought to be objective, hit it down the middle, show both sides. That was sort of imposed because of the nature of the medium. Because originally, broadcast television, there were only 3 major newspaper networks because the bandwidth was limited. And so the federal government felt justified in imposing the fairness doctrine. So if you have a spokesman for one party, you have to have a spokesman for the other party. And newspapers began to follow suit. So major newspapers like the New York Times, eventually the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, they also aspired to be objective. They wouldn't take the side of one party or another. But this broke down in the 1980s and 1990s with cable TV. Because once you have 500 channels, then you don't have to have a fairness doctrine. You can have a conservative channel, you can have a liberal channel. And so when the model broke down in television, then the model subsequently broke down in newspapers and their online versions. So, now if you want to hear the liberal news, you can watch MSNBC and read the Washington Post. If you want to hear the conservative side, you watch Fox News and read the Wall Street Journal. So we're really kind of back in that regard where we started in the 1790s.
Yeah, wow. It was like our lifetimes, it was not the norm, right, is what you're saying. Like, because, we're born in the 60s. We're a little bit younger than you, but basically the same era. And so this was normal to us for all of our lives, but it was not normal throughout the history of America. Right.
So, I grew up with Walter Cronkite.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
This oracular figure who would say, December 3rd, that's the way it is. Okay, it probably was, because Walter Cronkite has to pretty much play it down the middle. But that was, as you just said, a moment in American history. It wasn't the standard across the broad range of American history.
I once met Walter Cronkite at a hamburger store or hamburger shop in Kauai.
Did you really?
Yeah, we were just sitting there, and Walter Cronkite was right next to me. I think he had a Kono burger and fries. He was very nice. And if he's going to eat it, I'm going to eat it, right?
Sure. Was his voice in person like his voice on the air?
Oh yeah. It was exactly.
Wow, okay.
He had a big desk there and everything. It was great. I teach college too. I'm not a distinguished professor like you are, but and I teach communications and media, and when we're talking, my students always say, our country has never been as divided as it is right now, and I'm like, well, there's a little thing called the Civil War, and Vietnam and all these, all of these things. So, but comparatively, this is just the ebb and flow of democracy, right? I mean, it's just we happen to be at this place, right?
Yeah, and I think the reason, well, first of all, every generation thinks it's the superlative case of any adjective. It's always the best or the worst or the highest or the lowest or the fastest or the slowest or something. Every generation tends to think that history was leading up to it in everything. So that's natural. But the other thing is, one of the reasons that it seems that way today is that given social media, when everybody has a megaphone, and when the louder you shout and the more extreme the things you say, the more attention you get, I think we're more aware of the fringe opinions than we would have been in a time when not everybody had a voice. When the only way you heard things was when they were filtered through newspapers or television stations that had to find an audience. that had to appeal to as many people as possible. And so they couldn't develop just these extreme positions because the extremes are always pretty narrow. The narrow extremes are noisy, and they're the ones that get heard today. I'm not sure that the middle 80% of America is more divided than it was in the past. But we spend so much time hearing from the 10% on the left and the 10% on the right and think that's what characterizes the country today.
Right. It's like turning over the country to the crazy uncles at Thanksgiving dinner.
Yeah, on both sides.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
This has been great. And of course, you're not going to know what's going to happen in the next. What do we have? 48 days left of the election, right? What can we expect from a historical perspective of? I mean, not who's winning or losing, but just in general, are we going to get even more and more crazy with the verbiage, or what from your opinion, what do you think?
Is the fever going to break at any point in the next few years, in your opinion?
At some point, yes, because you can't be feverish forever. The real question, to start with the fact that Donald Trump is an oldish man. He's not going to live forever.
Right.
And I think the interesting question for the historian is what happens after Donald Trump? Will Donald Trump be this one-time thing, this one-time phenomenon that passes and its effect kind of washes away over time? Or has Trump changed the rules? Now, he hasn't changed the rules as the Democrats so far read the rules and play by. He's changed the rules to some degree the way the Republicans do it, at least for now. So when Donald Trump denied the outcome of the election of 2020, many Republicans said, no, that's not the way to do it. And they decried the January 6, 2021 events, the violence. But the party as a whole has swung around behind Trump because Trump's voters haven't abandoned him. Now, it kind of remains to be seen what will happen after Trump leaves. And if the voters, do they just kind of go away? Do they find another version? Maybe Don Jr. or Ron DeSantis hoped it was going to be him. So at any given time, what the historian wants to know is whether this unusual thing is unique in time or is it the beginning of a trend? And that's what the historian's going to want to know. Now, for a long time, in fact, right up until November 2020, I said, we'll all be a lot smarter after that election than before because Donald Trump kind of got elected in 2016 as a surprise candidate because nobody really took him seriously. And he won, but that was by surprise. And then I certainly thought that the presidency, the responsibility of the presidency is going to calm him down and he's going to wind up being a president like other presidents. Well, he wasn't. But then I could always say, if he gets reelected, then we will know something important, that this new model appeals to the American people. If he doesn't get reelected, then we'll know, it doesn't work, and we'll snap back to normal. Of course, Joe Biden got elected. Joe Biden was a pretty normal candidate and ran as a normal president. But Trump didn't go away, and Trump quite possibly will be elected a second time. So I think at this point, I don't think we're going to know the importance of Donald Trump until Donald Trump is no longer on the scene. Maybe he does retire, maybe he dies, and then we'll see if his effect lasts. So I don't expect to be a whole lot smarter 3 months from now than I am now on this phenomenon. It might take 10 years.
You have been humbled by these last few years.
Well, I got to tell you that I thought I knew something about the presidency. I thought I knew something about what kinds of candidates were elected. And I woke up on the day after the election of 2016.
Yeah.
And I said, I don't know anything about politics. I don't know anything about the presidency.
The publisher needs to recall all of your 28 books because you don't have any idea what's going on.
Right. This is the reason that in my books, I never predict the future.
Yeah.
Because who knows what the future is going to bring. I write everything in the past tense.
What are you working on now? Are you working on
Well, I got a new book that is coming out in 4 days, on next Tuesday.
Oh.
And it's on the debate over whether the United States should enter World War II. Oh. It's called America First, and the subtitle is Roosevelt, versus Lindbergh in the shadow of war.
Oh, wow. I'll check that one out.
Fantastic.
You've tapped into
And
our favorite
I started
subject.
the project because I simply thought it was interesting. In the time it took me to write it and the book to be published, I think it's become more timely than I thought it was going to, because we have two candidates for president who have strikingly different views of what America's role in the world ought to be. That's what the election of 1940, which was in the middle of this debate. So my story unfolds between the outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939 and Pearl Harbor, when Japan attacks the United States in December 1941. So this 2.25 year period. And the debate is over, what's the American role in the world? Does the United States need to become the leader of the world? Does the United States need to determine the outcome of the European war? Franklin Roosevelt said, yes, the United States does, and his actions led up in that direction. Charles Lindbergh, essentially channeling George Washington, who said, don't get involved in the affairs of Europe. Thomas Jefferson said, avoid entangling alliances. Lindbergh says that old tradition, that's still a good one. We should defend the United States within the Western Hemisphere. Don't defend the United States by going to Europe, by going to Asia. Lindbergh lost that debate. And ever since, the default setting of American politics, American foreign policy, has been that the United States is and should be leader of the free world, which means that when democracies are attacked, the United States ought to come to their aid, at least with money, maybe with weapons, maybe with troops. Donald Trump has taken a different view. He's challenged the premises of NATO, for example, which the United States is still a member of, and the United States is committed to go to the aid of any one of the NATO members if attacked. And Trump has said, well, maybe we don't do that. And Kamala Harris has not really spoken directly on what her foreign policy platform is going to be, but one supposes that she'll basically follow in the Biden-esque tradition of support for Ukraine, for example, against Russia. Donald Trump has said, no, we're going to end that war right away. And the only way we're going to end the war is for America to cut off aid to Ukraine. And so not since 1940, when Roosevelt was running for a third term on this interventionist platform, and Lindbergh was opposing him on the anti-interventionist platform, not since then have Americans had such a clear alternative. So what, voters, do you think the role of the United States in the world going forward should be? Should it be, as it's been for the last 80 years, the United States needs to lead the world so that if China attacks Taiwan, the United States needs to defend Taiwan? Or should America reconsider and tell the Taiwanese, you better cut the best deal you can with China. Tell the Ukrainians, you better cut the best deal you can with Russia. That, the affairs of Ukraine, the affairs of Taiwan are not the affairs of the United States. So we'll see how this debate, this election turns out.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm really
timely. Timely. It's a timely book. Where can people get that book?
Any bookstore starting on Tuesday, so September 24th. And of course, the online booksellers, Amazon, they can go directly to Penguin Random House, the publisher's Doubleday, which is a division of Penguin Random House.
Okay.
Are you doing a book tour coming to Chicago at all? Or do you?
I am.
Really?
Well, actually, I'm going to be passing through Chicago, but only on the way from Cleveland to Cincinnati. I'm going to O'Hare. But
okay. I was just going to say,
I don't have a stop in Chicago.
Yeah,
but
I don't know if you don't teach geography because I don't think going from Cleveland to Cincinnati through Chicago is really efficient. But
when you bring the airlines into the equation,
that or Atlanta. So yeah.
I was just in Wyoming, and my brother-in-law had to fly to San Francisco from Wyoming, so of course the airline sent him through Dallas.
Well, yeah,
we makes so much sense.
We were at Amsterdam and wanted to go to New York, and they flew us through San Francisco.
Oh, that's right.
So you're like, okay, that's
so. Next, we got to start working on geography.
Yeah,
books.
right. Okay, that'll be your next 30 books. Will be on the airline.
Right.
Thank you very much for coming on the show today. We really enjoyed it.
Oh, my pleasure.
H.W. Brands, Dr. Brands. Let's face it, the man has got a PhD.
Pulitzer Prize finalist. Did you win a Pinewood Derby trophy when you were a kid? I think you're the person that ends up.
I did not.
No, you didn't. Okay. What about a science fair? You win any science fairs or anything?
I think I did. maybe science
Yeah.
fair in 6th grade or something like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
So he's not a late bloomer like we are, because we're still waiting. We're still
Okay.
waiting for that to
Ah,
come.
okay.
But any day now, we're
Your
in our
best-
early
Your
60s.
best is yet to come.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show. I appreciate it. Have a great one.
It was good to talk to you.
All right.
Good luck.
thanks.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That was H.W.
Yeah.
Brands.
Well, I'm kind of hoping that the parallels to 1940 aren't all that exact.
Well,
Fred,
if it turns out the same way,
yeah.
I
but-
mean, in the election.
yeah, but I'd rather
Yeah.
not have another war.
You know, that was one of our most intellectual shows.
Oh my
ever.
God! Yeah.
All right, should we do
You know how
like a
many times-
fart joke or something
Yeah.
now?
Do you know how
or-
many times I've Googled things that he said? I'm like, no,
I feel like maybe we should, I don't know, start doing arm flapping farts.
Well, you know what we should do? We should cut our next show, which will have our regular show right after this, which will have all that in.
Okay.
So
Let's do
We'll
that.
get that out of our system.
We have people to thank. Thanks to Brandon Herman for
scoring the interview.
Another interesting guest. Tony Lasano, the executive producer of the show, Opie Productions. Also, Ed Silla with the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. Great Talk Radio isn't dead. In fact, it's gotten intellectual. And it's
You know
moved to a
what? I
better
just got my
place.
ACT scores. It went up 4 points. I'm now at 19. This is awesome.
We'll be back again soon with another episode of
Minutia Men Celebrity Interview.
The proceeding was a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network. Find our other great shows on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and at RadioMisfits.com. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of Opie Productions.
Tony, can you shut up?
It's like turning over the country to the crazy uncles at Thanksgiving dinner.